I think that for a lot of people, Western tonal music notation, or staff notation, is seen as what music notation is. And for some people who know it really well, that makes them feel kind of special, and maybe even a bit superior in some cases. But for other people who don't know it, or who find it difficult, that can make them feel pretty inadequate. But the thing is, there are probably more different approaches to writing down music than any one person could know. Staff notation is really good at communicating a whole bunch of different kinds of music. But ultimately, it's one of many systems that's good at some things and less good at others. The only true representation of a piece of music is a recording or performance itself. So every type of music notation expresses cultural and musical values because it has to choose certain information to prioritize and other information to ignore or assume that you already know. Music notation has different functions. It can be prescriptive, like instructions on how to play a piece, or it can be descriptive, meaning that it's meant to be like a record of a composition or a performance. Some notation can be mnemonic, meaning that it's just meant to jog the memory of the performer and doesn't contain enough information for somebody who doesn't know the piece already to perform it. Music notation works in all three ways to varying degrees. Different recordings of Beethoven's Fifth will sound different from one another, even though they use the same score. So the score is definitely more like a set of instructions on how to perform the piece than it is a description of the recording. But every recording of Beethoven's Fifth will still use all the same pitches and rhythms that are notated in the score, so it is still descriptive to a certain extent. And even though the score shows all the pitches and rhythms that make up the piece, you still need to be trained in Western tonal music theory to be able to use it. It doesn't come with a description of keys and meters or instructions on how to play the instruments, because that would sort of defeat the purpose of having a score in the first place. So although it might be a bit of a stretch to say that the score is mnemonic, it does rely on the reader having a whole bunch of background knowledge. Different styles of music notation are more precise in some ways and leave more room for interpretation in other ways. Some scores don't notate rhythms at all, and while staff notation does notate rhythms, different performers will interpret different rhythmic subtleties differently. And a MIDI roll on Ableton Live will show you exactly where an event will take place down to the sample. Some scores are treated like works of art. Others are written all in text, and some are digital or interactive. Some scores are also instruments, and there are even some scores that you can wear on your body. Anyway, so there are so many different ways of writing down music. And the specific way that the music is written down says a lot about what the people writing it down think is important. I think the best way to understand how different types of notation reflect different kinds of musical values is to look at a bunch of different examples. So let's take a look at notation. First, we'll look at some ancient notation styles, like the notation used during the Byzantine Empire and the notation from the 3,000-year-old Guqin from China. Then we'll look at some modern and experimental approaches from composers like CATHY BERBERIAN, IANNIS and DAPHNE ORAM. Let's start with the evolution of staff notation. Before music started getting written down in Western Europe, music was passed down from person to person. So people were used to not relying on music being written down in order to remember it, and the early versions of notation from Western Europe reflect this reality. Written music started in the church, where sacred texts were set to a kind of melodic chant called plain chant. The early versions of plain chant notation were used as a teaching aid and contained no set pitches or rhythms. These markings above the text are called neumes, and they basically just depict inflection. So the idea is that this syllable would have been sung something like this. Whoa! But the specific pitches that it was supposed to start and end at and how long it was to be held needed to be taught from the singer from somebody who already knew the piece. Sometime in the 8th century, Frankish monarchs wanted their church singers to adopt a Roman style of performance. So they pushed for the Roman style to be recorded in these neumes so it could be taught to the Frankish cantors. Although different neume systems developed at different times in different places, this seems like a pretty good reason to start writing down music. If people were used to following a specific but likely unquestioned set of conventions, then it makes sense to be able to refer them to a written reference in order to teach them a new set of conventions. It also would have been a great way to teach a large number of people, because the idea was to retrain everyone to sing in the new style. Over the next couple hundred years, this style developed into heightened neumes, where the vertical distance between the markings was meant to show the sort of relative distance between the pitches. And then in the early 11th century, a guy named GUIDO D'AREZZO had the idea to write the neumes on lines, to clarify the exact pitches to be used in a piece. This led to what we now call square notation. The stacks of squares are meant to be read as ascending pitches, and the diamonds are meant to be read as descending pitches from left to right. Then, in the mid-13th century, Franco of Cologne suggested that the shapes of the noteheads could be used to specify their duration. It took quite a while to catch on, but after about 400 years it became the standard way to notate polyphonic vocal music. In the meantime, older Neumes-style notations were still used for plain chant, and tablature was used for instrumental pieces. But when composers wanted to notate multiple independent parts to be played together, the ability to notate specific rhythms was extremely useful. Since then, we've added meters and key signatures, but otherwise our notation system hasn't changed very much since the 16th century. Meanwhile, a different system developed on the eastern part of the continent during the Byzantine Empire. This system was also a Neumes style, where markings were placed above the text. At first, the markings just communicated whether the pitch was supposed to go up or down, but eventually it developed into a system so complex that it can be fully transcribed into modern notation. Although the Byzantine Neumes system was much more detailed than the European one, the downside was that expressing all that information with a completely non-graphic system made it extremely complex and idiosyncratic. Each sign expressed a pitch interval and duration, so every sign was taken in context from the one before it, rather than expressing an absolute pitch. But some signs also expressed a dynamic level and/or an inflection, like staccato for example. But there wasn't a symbol for every possible iteration. So symbols with overlapping meanings had to be combined, and there was a long set of rules that defined which parts of which symbol would be performed and which would be ignored. So for example, there's the eson, which tells you to play the same pitch. But if you place the eson above a different sample, say one that tells you to go up a step, then the interval value of that symbol is #cancelled, but the duration and dynamic value of that symbol is kept. So if you wanted to repeat two pitches but sing the second one with vibrato, you would have to place the eson above the kufisma, which by itself tells you to go up a step and sing vibrato, but with the eson above it tells you to hold the same pitch and sing vibrato. This system reminds me a lot of written language. It's like, sure, there are technically a set of rules that describe the system, but there are so many exceptions and modifications that learning all the rules is probably not the best way to learn the system. It's sort of like the words plough, trough, and through in English. That shit just doesn't make any sense, and the only practical way to learn the different pronunciations is by memorizing them. Although the rules of this Neumes system are kind of dizzying now, I think there's pretty good evidence that it worked well for the chant-style music that it was meant to notate. In what is now Western Russia, the Byzantine Neumes system was developed into this beautiful hooks and banner style notation. It remained in frequent use for religious chant music until sometime after the 17th century, and is still used by some groups now. But when the music culture started to take on a more Western influence, staff notation was also developed, because clearly it's much better suited at notating more Western classical style music. The tablature for the guqin from China doesn't have any notes, but is instead instructions for how the performer should move their fingers. The earliest written records of the instrument come from around 1000 BC. The current tablature, called 简字谱, is a shorthand adaptation of the text-based score called 文字谱, that was pretty much like an essay that detailed all the actions to be taken by the performer. 简字谱 condenses 文字谱 by combining parts of the text-based characters to convey all the information necessary to perform a single musical event. A single character in the shorthand style usually tells the performer an action and a position for each hand. So on this symbol here, the bottom section tells you to pluck the 6th string by pressing your index finger and thumb together and moving it forward. On the top part, the symbol on the left is telling you to use your thumb, and the symbol on the right is telling you to press down on the 7th dot. There are also sometimes instructions to play with a harmonic, slide up or down, use multiple fingers, or change tempo. If you want a more detailed explanation of the tablature, check out this video linked above on the Avenue X channel. Some of the scores that we looked at earlier were beautiful to look at just as much as they were instructions on how to play a piece of music. It makes sense that writing down a piece of music for one of the first times would have been a big deal, and people would have wanted to take their time with it and make it beautiful. In general, when written music became less of a novelty, composers were less likely to treat their scores as a work of art. But there always have been people compelled by this idea, especially in the mid-20th century. Before it became popular in the 60s and 70s, score as aesthetic object had a real moment in 14th century France. The most famous scores from that era come from the Chantilly Codex, like this one of a song called Belle Bon Sage by Bolt-Collier. The heart shape doesn't correspond to any formal parameters, but I do think it would be a bit short-sighted to say that it doesn't express anything. The music also is amazing. The secular music of the Chantilly Codex by Ensemble Pan is one of my favorite medieval records. They have recordings of Belle Bon Sage and a bunch of other bangers from that era. In 1966, the singer CATHY Berberian interpreted the onomatopoeic sounds from comic book strips into her piece called Stripsody. That's pretty much how I behave when I'm in a good mood. She worked with an illustrator named Roberto ZAMARIN to realize the scores. George Crumb, like GYÖRGY, wanted his scores to represent the symbolism and concepts in his work. In Circle of Infinity, he wanted to represent what he saw as the infinite sonic possibilities of the piano. And this one sort of looks like what it feels like to be alive right now. You can just see the environment and the economy spiraling downward like water in a flushing toilet. This score for This Is Why Some People OD on Pills and Jump Off the Golden Gate Bridge, made by Jennifer Walsh in 2004, is printed on a t-shirt. There are text instructions for the performer that involve skateboarding, feeling feelings, and finally making sound at the very end. This meeting of score, performance art, and visual art seems like a pretty natural development of the idea of score as artwork in a contemporary context. For other 20th century composers, graphic notation was a way to explore new approaches to authorship, intentionality, and determinism. Earl Brown was interested in graphic notation as a way to express the sensibilities of his performers as a composition itself. This notation for his piece, December 1952, is meant to be interpreted as a picture of space at this instant, and is supposed to be set into motion by the performer, by either sitting and letting it move or moving through it at all speeds. For Morton Feldman, no relation, graphic notation was a way of realizing his goal of making music that was freed from compositional or logical rhetoric. Unlike Brown, he wanted to remove the memories and sensibilities of the performer that reflected conditioned responses from human beings in a society and liberate the autonomy of the aesthetic object. In his pieces Projection 1 and 2, he used graphic notation to notate timbre, time, and dynamic relationships, but leave pitches 100% indeterminate. So the performer would choose the pitches completely at random. John Cage was also interested in removing memories, tastes, likes, and dislikes from his music, and used graphic notation in many of his pieces that used aleatoricism as a compositional method. In the 50s and 60s, composers started to use graphic notation as a way to have a two-dimensional representation of a piece. This type of score is a great example of descriptive notation because in most electronic music, the recording is the performance itself. Poème électronique by Edgar Varèse and Artikulation by GYÖRGY Ligeti are some well-known examples of this. The only example of a score for electronic music that's actually prescriptive that I know of is the realization score for Contacta by Karlheinz Stockhausen. And as far as I know, no one has actually reconstructed the piece, which is not all that surprising considering how incredibly detailed Contacta is. One amazing new concept that electronic music has made possible is the blurring of the lines between score and instrument. Daphne Oram's ORAMICS instrument is a great example of this. If you want to learn in detail about ORAMICS, check out this video I made about Daphne Oram and her instrument. But the basic idea is that you draw out how the parameters of sound change over time on strips of film. IANNIS picked up on this idea in the late 70s and developed an instrument that allows you to realize electronic sounds in real time by drawing graphic notation on a tablet called the UPIC. You start out by choosing the waveform and then you can draw how the sounds change over time. The UPIC has since been developed into an incredibly powerful software that you can download called IANNIS. It can be used at multiple speeds at the same time, supports JavaScript code inside the sequences, and is fully open source. A more commercial instrument that took influence from the UPIC is the FAIRLIGHT CMI that has a built-in step sequencer and effects. My favorite part of the CMI though is that it was sample-based. It was one of the first instruments to make those amazing super 80s sample-based sounds. The most influential iteration of this very new instrument as score concept has been the DAW, or Digital Audio Workstation. Most people who make electronic music now use a program like Ableton Live, Logic, or FL Studio. And yes, a DAW is definitely a valid example of graphic notation. So valid. In fact, it's the most flexible form of notation that I can think of. You can cycle through so many different perspectives in just a few clicks. Finally, there are haptic approaches to notation. Braille notation was invented by Louis Braille in the early 19th century, and is now commonly in use. It's more or less a Braille adaptation of staff notation, and uses the same 6 cell characters as Braille text, but has its own meanings, syntax, and abbreviations. One of my old professors, Sandeep Bhagwati, invented the bodysuit score, where information is transmitted to the performer through vibro-tactile feedback devices sewn into the suit. The suit also collects data on its physical location and the sounds around the performers. The team developed their own score reading technique that is specific to the suit. Whew! That was a lot of different kinds of notation. I'm pretty much exhausted. Anyways, as we've seen, there are a lot of different approaches to notation, each with their own priorities, advantages, and disadvantages. Unfortunately, there were so many interesting examples that I had to leave out, and of course there are just tons that I haven't heard of yet. So if there's something you wish that I okay, I'm done with this shit. I'm over it. Okay, that's the end of the video. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching this episode of Sounds Good. Normally I do these videos outside, but as you can see, I'm inside today to show off my new merch. I'm so excited to have two different kinds of t-shirts to offer you guys. So I have this one, and then I have one that's black with white text on it. And I am totally obsessed with the design. I got the Sounds Good logo here, Sounds Good text. I got a grid, which I love a grid. And some Soundwave adjacent stuff here, and the YouTube link on there. So you can get those at my Big Cartel Soundsgood channel.bigcartel.com. They are 25 bucks each. So for my US and UK viewers, you can get a t-shirt for super cheap. And yeah, if you want to support my channel on a more regular basis, you can do so on my Patreon at patreon.com/soundsgoodchannel, where you can get access to all kinds of extra goodies like early access to the videos, behind the scenes, get your name in the credits, and other stuff. So if you're interested in that, head on over to my Patreon and check it out.